I'll go ahead and get started. Today I'll be talking about SSRFs. What are they? How do we recreate them? And how do we get paid for them? By get paid, I am talking about bug bounty programs. If you go out to HackerOne.com or bugcrowd.com, many public bug bounty programs are hosted there. You can make a free account, look for public bug bounty programs, and submit valid findings for a one-time payment. HackerOne and BugCrowd have another type of program called a vulnerability disclosure program. It allows you to get reputation. Reputation is a type of point system that opens doors to things like private bug bounty programs. If you go to HackerOne and look at the See Opportunities page, you'll see something like this where we have an example of 3 companies. Here we see Amazon's public bug bounty program where we can get $150 to $25,000 per submission, and then 2 vulnerability disclosure programs. Sometimes vulnerability disclosure programs are referred to as responsible disclosure programs. But we want to submit for SSRF, so I will give 4 examples of companies with public bug bounty programs and what their payments look like. Here we have Facebook, Instacart, Uber, and Yahoo.com. Facebook does not use HackerOne or bugcrowd.com. They host their own bug bounty program. Remember, I said many public bug bounty programs are hosted on those 2 websites, but many other companies host their own public bug bounty programs. Facebook.com has a very extensive guideline. If you go out to their page, they have a payout guideline for SSRF specifically, and if you zoom in, you can see that you can get up to $40,000 per submission. Instacart does have a HackerOne account. If you go to HackerOne and look at public bug bounty programs, you will see payments listed by severity. When we talk about SSRFs, we are talking about a high severity or a critical severity rating. For Instacart, they tend to pay out the maximum severity payment. So for SSRFs, we are looking at $7,500. Uber pays out $5,000 to $10,000 for high severity ratings. And Yahoo pays $3,000 to $10,000. Being a bug bounty hunter and signing up for bug bounty accounts isn't like having a second day job or needing to interview or committing time to a whole nother career path. It's when you have spare time, you map out a web app, look for vulnerabilities, and if you find something, you can get paid. Who am I and why am I talking about bug bounty programs and SSRFs? My name is Yelena Williams, and I happen to help run a private bug bounty program for a large financial institution. I also specialize in web app penetration testing. However, I am not here talking about my employer today. I am simply trying to share the knowledge that I have picked up along the way and my own personal experiences. So let's get started. What is an SSRF? If we break up what it stands for, so we're looking at a server-side request forgery, that's what SSRF stands for, then we are looking for a vulnerability on the server side. And when we say request forgery, we're talking about crafting a request in such a way that we trick a server into doing something it shouldn't. So in simple terms, we have a web app vulnerability. And when I say trick a server into doing something it shouldn't, I'm talking about telling the server to go download a malicious file or potentially giving us internal-only documents. But most importantly, we will go over actual examples together. There are two categories of SSRF, our standard SSRF and our blind SSRF. A standard SSRF fetches data. A blind SSRF, we cannot view the response. They both trick a server into doing something it shouldn't. The difference is you don't have control over what that server is doing as much with a blind SSRF as you do with a standard where you're fetching data and viewing that data in your response. Today, we will focus on standard SSRFs because they are more straightforward. If you have looked up SSRFs, you may have seen a diagram such as this one, where an attacker sends some sort of packet to a public server. That public server forwards on that packet to an internal server, and then a response comes back to the attacker. If we break that down, what we are saying is you are an attacker interacting with a URL. In this example, we're seeing facebook.com. That interaction, that packet, that request you are sending could be as simple as logging in. We want to attach a malicious payload to that request. That might look like this. We have our username and a password, and then at the end of the password, we might attach a malicious payload. Now, when you interact with a URL, what you're really doing is interacting with a public server. A public server is meant to be publicly facing. So you have client-side code on that server, maybe snippets of server-side code. But it's the less sensitive data that is meant to be accessible by the public. And if it needs to, that public server will forward on requests to an internal server. So here you see your packet A gets transformed to packet B. Sometimes headers might change on your public server when it gets forwarded on, but the data and the payload in which you attach to that data should remain the same. Now, when it goes to the internal server, if we can trick that internal server responding when it shouldn't, we have an SSRF. If we cannot review that data or what the server is doing, then we have a blind SSRF. But if we can fetch data in our response, we have a standard SSRF. Why does this matter? In 2019, somebody working for Capital One took advantage of a vulnerable WAF using SSRF, an SSRF. You see at the top here, I have an image of a curl command on Bash. It goes to Capital One. Here we have our vulnerable endpoint. We have a query command, and that query command tells that an internal server to go out to our malicious site, where we would have some sort of script on that site that would tell the server to pull data for us, documents, things of that nature. When we submit reports to bug bounty programs, we would need to get used to seeing and writing something called an impact statement. An impact statement should review your individual vulnerability and what you're able to accomplish. Now, remember I said SSRFs tend to be a high, but can be a critical. What took this SSRF from a high to a critical was the quality of the data leaked. Page was able to obtain social security numbers and account numbers of 106 million Capital One customers, amongst other things. She was going on Twitter when the FBI caught up with her, bragging about her vulnerability and threatening to sell this information on the black market. This goes to show how dangerous SSRFs can be when they're leveraged by the wrong person, and how important bug bounty programs can be. See, if companies had even if companies had the best security team and the #1 tools, they would still have vulnerabilities in their network. Bug bounty programs allow for a large pool of people to test and report vulnerabilities before somebody who is malicious can find them so that they can be remediated. So how do we recreate an SSRF? We need to start with some tools. Here we have Fiddler, curl, and Burp Suite. Fiddler is great. They have a professional version only, and it can cost either $10 a month if you subscribe monthly or $120 a year. They have a free trial if you'd like to try it out, and it looks very nice. It has a graphical user interface. Burp Suite, which is what I use, the professional version of Burp Suite, is a lot more expensive. The professional version costs $500 a year, and there's no monthly subscription option. However, Burp Suite has a free version called Community Edition that's always free. The only issue is it does lack quite a bit of functionality. It looks very nice as well. It has a graphical user interface, or a GUI. And then curl, you don't necessarily need curl. However, if you today do not have Burp Suite or Fiddler, you can take my curl commands and use them. Curl is built into Windows 10 and 11, and it is on Mac operating systems as well as Linux operating systems. You already have the tools to recreate the vulnerabilities I show you today using my curl commands if you were to go home and copy and paste them into your command line or your terminal. That being said, curl is very powerful. You can leverage it in many of the same ways in which we leverage Burp Suite and Fiddler, but because it is a command line looking like this, that means you are writing your own scripts and making your own tools, and it is a lot more work. The big benefit here is the same benefit that you're getting out of it. If you are working with somebody who does not have a tool you have, such as Burp Suite or Fiddler, you can provide a curl command for them to be able to observe a vulnerability's behavior for themselves using the curl command you provide them. Okay. From here until we see this diagram again, we're going to focus on packet A. If you don't know what a packet is, it is your interaction between the URL and a server. So when we're interacting with a URL, we're using a protocol such as HTTP or HTTPS. Your packet will include your protocol, your route to get there, quite a few other things, and then your data. Your data could be the body of an email that you're sending, or like we saw earlier, our login information. And remember, we want to attach malicious payloads to that data. So we need to learn and focus the next many slides on learning common targets to put malicious payloads and how to write malicious payloads. The malicious payload portion of this talk is fairly easy. We will be leveraging a free resource online called Payloads All the Things. You can use your phone to get the QR code, or you can Google Payloads All the Things. I will show how to use Payloads All the Things payloads as is, and then how to customize them. But where do I put my payloads? We'll put them in one of two places. Common targets on a user input field or in the URL. You'll look for common targets on the URL as well. We'll start with user input fields. Your login form was a user input field. A comment section where you can leave comments is a user input field. Contact forms have multiple user input fields. If you can put a first name a last name, and an email address. All three of those options are different user input fields. Messaging apps, user input. Webhooks is a fantastic target for SSRFs. Remember, I said we want to go after common targets. So if we look at webhooks, they look like this. They look like a search bar. They're very different. I would not test on a search bar. I want to go after common targets. Technically, anything with user input can be tested for SSRFs. However, the big difference between a search bar and a webhook is search bars index already existing data. A webhook takes your user input and calls for an action from the server. Remember, we're trying to trick a server into doing something it shouldn't. So something like a webhook that takes unique user input and gives us a unique action from the server is perfect for testing. And that'll be our first example. I have a lab environment set up. It is created by Benji Trap. It's on GitHub. You can use that QR there to go grab it. It is called SSRF Playground. Now, because we are using a lab environment instead of going out to a website and web mapping, we are going to have to change our strategy in two major ways. The first way is that we are looking for clues on the lab environment for what we are looking for. And then the second thing is that instead of fetching data like internal documents, we are looking for a flag. Flags replace the idea that we found something sensitive like a password file, for instance. Now, I understand that this lab looks kind of small, so I will zoom in on the clue here. On the page, we see that there is a file path called etcflag.txt. If you do not know what etc is, it looks like /etc. It is a common Linux server file path. It tends to have sensitive files such as etc path, etc shadow, etc password, and they're very common to go look for in order to get sensitive files off of a server. So here we have our file as etcflag.txt because remember, in a lab environment, we look for flags instead of sensitive data. Now we need to go to payload all the things and get a payload. If you search for etc and payload all the things, you will get 4 examples of payloads using a file protocol. A file protocol looks like file, :// And then we have our file path. In these payload examples, they use etc password. I'm going to copy the second payload down and show you that if you paste that payload into this webhook as is, you will get good information back. So we have etc password. We select to test it. And in the URL, we can see a large page of data to include the line that I've bolded here for file :// and then our path /etc/flag.txt. My goal in showing you this is that if you are uncomfortable with the idea of customizing your payloads from payloads all the things, you can use them as is and get good information back. If you're ready for the next step or a little bit more advanced, you could have customized your file protocol payload to include that custom file path already, because remember, we already had the file path etcflag.txt. Okay, we go ahead and we copy and paste it from the body of our web page, and we put it in our webhook, and then we select test it, and we get back our flag. Here it's highlighted in blue at the bottom. It says welcome to the jungle. That is an example of testing payloads on a user input field and then reviewing fetched data in the body of your URL. But what about the body of your website? But what about URLs? How do we do the same thing, adding payloads to a common target in the URL? First, we need to know what common targets look like. And by the very end of this talk, I will give you a long list of common targets that you can leverage. But we want to look out for things such as API endpoints, file uploads, database queries, webhooks, anything with an image. We just looked at webhooks in a user input field, but what does it look like in the URL? Here we have our domain, example.com, and then our route would be webhook. Route is a common terminology for websites. It's anything that comes after your domain. So your domain is example.com, and anything after domain, your domain will be your route. So webhook is your route. Naming conventions change. So in the URL, it won't always say webhook verbatim. You need to know other types of common terminology. And so for webhooks, you can look out for callback and notify. Here is a small list of common URL targets. So remember I said APIs. Here's an example of API version 1 resource. Or a second example of APIs would be GraphQL. Anything that renders or resizes or calls to an image. There's webhooks. I want to zoom in on this last example here for favicon.ico. If you do not know what favicon is, it's that little icon that you see when you favorite a URL. So for Yahoo, you'll see a purple Y when you favorite Yahoo. That is favicon.ico. Here's what it looks like in your URL. We have our domain and then favicon.ico. And here is our payload. When we go out to payloads all the things, you can use many payloads for favicon.ico. I encourage you to go through and look and see which payloads you want to try. But we are going to learn something that is labeled payloads with localhost. You'll see 6 examples of payloads here. The first half of them say http:// and then localhost. The second set have 127.0.0.1. They are the same thing. One is in text and one is a digit. These are loopbacks, and what loopbacks refer to is the process of a computer sending itself data. So what this payload is looking to do is trick a server into responding because it thinks it made the request itself. Now you might notice there is a colon and then port numbers after these loopbacks. We have port 80, port 443, and port 22. The data that we want to fetch with this payload is whether the port is opened or closed. So if I have example.com like we saw before in the URL and then our target for favicon, and I want to paste this payload in as is, I put the payload right after the domain and before the target. So it looks like example.com /http:// 127.0.0.1 I'm using port 22 in my examples, that's secure shell, and then /favicon.ico. Now we will stick with this version of using the payload, but I did want to point out that there are ways to customize this payload. In your tests, what you're going to want to do is test all of the common ports to see if they're open or closed, not just one or two, all of the common ports, and then you will want to test something called a query parameter to see if the query parameters are an additional thing you can see are vulnerable. They look like $URL equals. You can try different query parameters such as IMG would be great for favicon because it's an image. You can try the $redirect equals. Google query parameters and get a list of them and try them out. And this is what that formatting would look like with that payload. We have our domain, and then our target, favicon.ico, then our query parameter, question mark URL equals, and then our payload, the loopback, :22, and then /WAC favicon.ico again. I won't go into too much about query parameters, but I did want to show that to you, and if you'd like to try that out after the talk, I will provide this PowerPoint. Okay, well, before we saw our fetch data on the web page itself, but how do we view fetch data when it doesn't populate on the web page? And that's when we need to start using our tools such as Burp Suite and curl. So if you follow along, you can open up Burp Suite, go to your proxy, then the subtab for intercept, and open browser. There are two main ways to capture traffic when using Burp Suite, and this is just one of them. This is what we will be using going forward, is the built-in browser to Burp Suite. It uses a Chromium browser. When you open it, it looks like this, and you're going to go out to example.com. There's example.com loaded. When I load example.com, I can view that traffic under this sub-tab, HTTP history. You might notice our route /WAC favicon.ico. I know that favicon.ico is a common target, so I am going to right-click on it, that line of traffic, send to repeater, and then go to my repeater tab on Burp Suite. You will see that request on the left titled titled requests. And I know this is a little small, but remember, we're just pasting in our payload as is right before our target, favicon.ico. So let me make this larger for you. The first line looks like a get command. That's because we're using HTTP. And then our target, /WAC favicon.ico, we're using a version 2 of HTTP. And then the second line shows a header that says host. And then our domain here is example.com. This is what it looks like to view a URL in Burp Suite. And when we want to manipulate the URL, we have to send it to repeater, and then we can add our payload there. So here on the first line, I have get, and then my payload, that loopback, :22, and then our target, /WAC favicon.ico. Don't touch anything else, just select to send it. When you send it, you will see the response line filled up, unless you're me. In that case, this example.com. I think I had I think my proxy was misconfigured, but I'll give you another example of what it looks like to view a request and response in repeater. Here you see that same payload for get HTTP 127.0.0.1:22 and then favicon. I've blocked out the host, and then on the right we have a 200 OK with a response, and I will show you how to read these responses in a minute. First of all, I would like to point out that we left off here on the repeater tab with our payload already ready to go in our request, and then we were going to hit send. But I told you I would teach you curl, so I want to point out that you can right-click on this request, select to copy as curl command, and you will get the curl command for bash. Bash is used on Mac operating systems and Linux operating systems. It goes to your clipboard, so I opened a notepad here, and you can see my curl command that I can provide to you, or you can provide to developers or anybody who wants to view the observed behavior that doesn't have your tools if they're using Mac or Linux. If you're using Windows, it is very easy to learn how to write a curl command. Here I have, instead of a terminal open for Mac or Linux, for Windows I have the command prompt open. And I have my command written out here, but it's small, so let me make it larger. Our command starts with curl and then space -v. V means verbose. I want a longer response for example.com, so I put -verbose. And then you have another space, and you're going to paste in the URL and the target with the payload that we already learned how to write. So it goes domain, payload, and then / your target favicon.ico. And then you're going to press enter. Because we put that -v, we get a long response. I have to scroll all the way to the top, and you'll see at the top, for example.com, I got a 404 not found. Now we need to learn how to read these responses. We've learned how to fetch data if it comes back to us on the web page, and we've learned how to add payloads to user input fields as well as URLs. We've even learned how to go on to Burp Suite and curl and look at responses when we add payloads to our URL targets. How do we read those responses? First, I will remind you that we are focusing on standard SSRFs. Standard SSRFs are the most straightforward because we cannot know if we have an SSRF based off status code alone. And the nice thing about standard SSRFs is, yeah, we get a 200 or a 300 status code, but we also fetch data. So how do we look at a response with fetch data? If you look at the example I showed earlier on that blocked out host, on the right I have 3 boxes. The first box is our 200 OK. So the most common status code for a valid standard SSRF will be a 200 OK or something in the 300 range. Here we have a 200 OK. And in the second box, I have blocked out internal URLs. So you can see the HTTPS and you can see the .com, but I blocked them out. Now, companies tend to have a public-facing URL that is meant to be accessible by the public, and then they have internal use only URLs that are supposed to only be viewable and accessible when you are logged into the company network. Seeing internal URLs is a form of fetched data, but the most important fetched data that we see here is on the last box where it says SSH for secure shell, and then it gives us an open SSH version and a protocol mismatch. We know the port is open because we got a protocol mismatch and a 200 OK. Open SSH was expecting us to connect over port 22, but we sent this payload over port 80. So we got a protocol mismatch. Now remember I said you need to test many ports. When I get a closed port, I won't get fetch data and I'll get a 404. Okay? We'll go over that again in a minute. For now, I'll touch on blind SSRFs. They are very nuanced. Here I say you might have a blind SSRF if you get a 200 OK or 300 status code. In reality, you need to have more information, more proof that you might have a blind SSRF. For instance, you might do some sort of timing attack where you try to see if you get a slower response back because you're touching an internal server. My advice is to start with the more straightforward standard SSRFs, and when you have some success with valid submissions to bug bounty programs, then move on to blind SSRFs. You might get a 200 OK or a 300 status code without fetch data, and it looks like this. Here we have a curl command with a 301 move permanently, and then no fetch data. Now when you're first starting out, these responses can be very overwhelming. They have a lot of lines and a lot of data on them. If I go back to Burp Suite, I know it's very subtle, but remember host, comma, and then we saw example.com on that second line for our requests in Burp Suite. Host is a type of header. They're in blue. If you go line by line and look at your headers and Google them and try to get familiar with common responses in headers, you'll get familiar with what is potentially sensitive versus what is common. On curl, each new line item has a caret before it. So my advice is, when you see these responses, Google each header until you get more familiar with them. How do we know if we do not have an SSRF? Well, typically, the most common response is some sort of error, so HTTP 404, something in the 400s, which comes from your client side, or something in the 500s, which comes from your server side. You can get a connection timeout error, a DNS resolution error, some sort of custom error page. We saw that earlier on example.com. Now, that's, again, another rule that I've given you, just to have a foundation for what is most common. But when we use something like the loopback command when we're looking for ports, you do want to test all of the common ports, because you will get a 404 with no fetch data on closed ports. That being said, I didn't do that with example.com because I truly believe that example.com is not vulnerable to SSRFs. Okay, now we know that we look out for common targets such as any user input field or common targets in the URL. And we know that I will give you a longer list of common targets in the URL. But when we're looking at a web app, how do we find user input fields and common targets in the URL? We need to web map that app manually using Burp Suite. When we map the web app, we're doing a couple of things. We're getting to know that web app, and we're going through and we're finding user input fields and highlighting those lines of traffic so we can test them later. There is a target tab on Burp Suite that allows you to find common targets. We will learn how to use that target tab specifically with SSRFs. I will disclaimer that there are automated tools that do these things for you in Burp Suite. They have their time and place. However, it is important to know how those tools work by understanding how to manually do those steps yourself. And also, it's important to know that doing things manually can be very, very powerful. If you use something like a spider tool on Burp Suite, you're going to potentially miss targets on more complex web apps because it's dependent on links. So if there's no link to get out to another target, then you'll miss that target. That being said, I definitely recommend looking into some automation, but for now, I will just be teaching how to do this manually. We will start with our Burp browser, and we will be targeting facebook.com. When I go to facebook.com inside my Burp browser, it takes me to a login page. And I want to show you that if we go to the proxy tab in Burp Suite, and then the HTTP history tab like we did before to view the traffic, when we load that login page, we get 33 lines of traffic. We will learn to filter that out in a moment, but for now, what we want to do is click on everything. Try to grab as much unique traffic as possible off of Facebook. So I go through on the bottom, find links, and I right-click and open a new tab. To save time, I stop at Marketplace, and I'll go to Marketplace and choose a listing to click on. Here we have a free Tesla Model 3. There's save, there's share. When I click on these options, I get halted by the login page again. I can view typical features. I'm not going to go through and click on all of the listings in Facebook Marketplace. That's not my goal. My goal is to click on unique traffic. So maybe I'll capture 1 or 2 listings in Marketplace, but once I've captured that type of traffic, I can move on. Now, when I exit out of the listing, I get prompted for a user input field that asks for a zip code And we've seen 2 user input fields so far, correct? We saw something for a login page, and then we saw a zip code. You want to highlight traffic that has user input fields as you go along, and how you do that is you need to interact with the user input. Here I put in a zip code for Mesa because we're at Cactuscon in Mesa, 85203. And when I go to my traffic, there's a search bar under the request box where I can put 85203, step through my traffic until I see a match, and then it also highlights 85203 in the body of my request. That's how I know that my user input field for that zip code functionality is line 1952. I can right click on it, select to highlight, and then mark it a color of my choosing. I chose green, and now you see that line of traffic is green. I'll do the same thing for any other user input field. So we did skip over it, but on the login page, I'll put test@test.com. I'll search for test under the request field. I'll get 2 matches because I put it twice. I'll see test highlighted twice in the body of my request. I'll highlight it. And now when I am done mapping my web app and I am ready to test user input fields, I can go to this filter option above my traffic. A prompt appears and I can select to show only highlighted items, hit apply, and it filters only highlighted items. That is why we do that. Now we can right click and send to repeater like we did before, or we can right click and there's an option to open in browser. You can test it in the browser and view the traffic that comes in if you prefer. Now we need to find target in our URL. And you know what? Let me back up. I do want to mention we had over 1,950 lines of traffic, nearly 2,000 lines of traffic. That was all from that 30-second video I showed you of me clicking on everything. And I didn't even click on everything. I stopped at Marketplace. So we need help filtering out our common targets, and that's where the target tab comes into play. Remember, we want to get paid. So on the left, we have a ton of different URLs, some of which don't even say FB or Facebook in them. This one says Wolfram. We're going to right click on the URLs that say Facebook, and we will select the second option to add to scope. And just like when we highlighted our user input and then filtered out, we'll do the same thing here. The filter option at the top here, you can click on it, and this time instead of show only highlighted items, you'll select to show only in scope items and then hit apply. And now we can just see Facebook and Facebook.com, our trees. Now our goal is to get paid at the end of the day. And so you need to go out to your target's bug bounty program and see which URLs are in scope. This is a very small snippet of Facebook's in-scope URLs. Here we have eligible items to include meta.com, facebook.com, fb.com, and then ineligible items such as fbsbx.com. But there were many, many targets in that list that was just a small snippet. So when you are testing, you will want to filter out anything that is not a target in your bug bounty program. Okay, let's go back to the target tab. We have facebook.com filtered out, and where I have my box is a little drop-down option. The facebook.com and facebook.com, these are called trees. If you click that little drop-down, you can see the branches. And in the branches, I immediately see an API branch. Remember, API is a target we want to look out for. And if we click on it, we can view routes to include one of our common targets that I had listed before, GraphQL. You can right click on that, line of traffic and send to repeater and add our payloads just as we did before. Remember I said at the very end of this talk I would give you a longer list of common URL targets. Here it is. I will provide a QR code to my GitHub of this talk so that you can access this resource if you would like. But before we are done, I need to go over some basic remediation. The conversation for remediation will change based off who you are talking to. So I am on the red team. I focus on penetration testing. Therefore, I care about fixing the root cause of the issue. I think my colleague and I will be doing a talk, red teamer versus blue teamer, on how to mitigate and remediate and also target SSRFs either next Cactuscon if we get approved for our submission or at another convention that we were hoping to apply for. But for now, I will just tell you my side of the story. We care about server-side code remediation. Our problem is on the server side. So with SSRFs, remember our request got forwarded on from the public server. So if I give my SSRF issue to a developer and they choose to block the request being forwarded on the client side code on the public server, it'll fix this issue and the way in which I've leveraged this SSRF. But if a hacker finds a way around that block and reaches the server side code or the internal server again, the internal server will still be vulnerable to SSRFs unless you fix the code. There are two main ways to fix the code. For URLs, you can do user input validation or something called URL sanitization, which is a very broad term that can mean many things, but for SSRFs, it means to validate and filter URLs the server is allowed to access. So like a whitelist list for a server, it's saying what it is allowed to access as far as URLs. It's trying to filter out URLs that have a malicious payload added to them. Now I mentioned you can do input validation on the URL, but for a user input field, you will also do input validation. There are two ways to approach input validation: whitelisting and regex. Whitelisting, and you wouldn't want to do a blacklist because if you say, hey, don't allow dots, a good hacker will find another thing to exploit your SSRF or your server again and again and again. They will try dash next, and then you'll block dash, and then they'll try forward whack, and the list will go on and on. The best methodology is whitelisting over blacklisting. Or you can use something called a regular expression or regex. It looks like this. Here we have a regular expression on a username field. So my handle is Yelena of Troy. That's my username. When you put a regular expression on a user input field, what this is saying is you want to start with anchors. This is a big mistake I see when regular expressions lack anchors. The caret and the $sign are saying, hey, don't allow strings before or after my regular expression. And then this first section has a lowercase a through z and a capital A through z. It's saying my username field has to start with a letter. The second section is a join with a question mark. That question mark is called a positive look ahead. Its job is to say, hey, anything after the first character, which had to be a letter, can include a special character that is a dot, an underscore, or a dash. But because of our positive look ahead, our question mark, that period, underscore, or dash cannot be repeated twice without being followed up by our second section here, A through Z or 0 through 9. So I can have a username that says Yelena of Troy, but I cannot have 123 Yelena of Troy. And then I can have a username that says Yelena.Troy, but I cannot have a username that says Yelena.Troy. And you might have noticed this second section includes a plus sign at the end. That plus sign is specific to alphanumerics. It's saying that not only can you not repeat your special characters, you can't follow them up with a number. So we can have a username that is Yelena.Troy, but not Yelena.123Troy. This is a very oversimplified example of regular expressions. I had this Scan Me QR code up. It goes out to regex101.com where you can paste this example into regex101 and see which usernames get approved and not approved. So you can start being able to understand regular expressions. As you get more advanced, they will become important. But for now, I just wanted to show you a very common methodology to securing user input fields. It's called regex. In conclusion, we've learned SSRFs, but we have focused on standard SSRFs. I encourage you to go out and look for standard SSRFs that fetch data and to use public bug bounty programs as your lab environment. Go look for public bug bounty programs, read their policy, and then start testing on the URLs in scope. Make sure you do get familiar with their policy. Some companies have special regulations that they want you to follow. I do have a GitHub with this PowerPoint on it to include all of the resources I've provided today. It is at this QR code, and you can pull it up while I take some questions. I believe we have time for 1 or 2 questions.